Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for WorQor Lar Dor Extreme, where we face off against the fierce Valley Garmonda. This is the first extreme trial made available in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your trial guide. Before we begin, players will need to determine pair partners and light party groups. Ideally, you'll want melees paired with tanks and ranged players paired with healers. Each pair will have a specific spot to stack together based on the mechanic, and these waymarkers are used to facilitate that throughout the encounter. The encounter will begin with Spike Sickle. Multiple blue lines will flash across the platform in a pattern that will either begin on the left or the right side of the platform. Players will need to watch carefully to identify where the first blue line appears, and then move to the opposite edge of the platform in preparation for the barrage of ice. Ice spikes will shoot across the platform, over the same pattern that was indicated by the blue lines. At the same time, each attack will also deposit an extra ice boulder on the edge of the platform that will soon explode in a wide circle. To handle this, players can wait for the second or third ice spike to shoot past them before moving back towards the center. Using the boss's hitbox arrow as a guideline, you can overshoot the center a bit here, opposite the side you came from, to wait out the first two ice boulder explosions. Once those go off, the center of the platform, right on the tip of the arrow marker, will be safe from the rest of the explosions. Carefully place your character there to wait out the rest of the mechanic. The boss will then cast Sky Ruin, and this volcano marker will appear, indicating the start of the fire mini phase. This cast will deal high damage and place a 12-second fire debuff on all players as well, so healers be ready. Tri-Scourge will deal more raid-wide damage and place ice, fire, and lightning scourge debuffs on players that will resolve later in the mini phase based on their timers. The timers are dependent on the players' role group and generally can be ignored for now. A volcanic eruption will begin from either the left or right side volcano. Once identified, players will need to move to the opposite side of the platform to avoid the massive circle attack from the active volcano. As they do that, 3 sets of ground AoE circles will target players, and they'll need to move out of these areas as necessary. The boss will then do one of 3 possible attacks you're familiar with from normal mode: the frontal cone beak attack, the room-wide donut attack, or the massive circle attack. Players will need to watch the boss's movements to determine which attack is coming and adjust to their appropriate waymarker locations with their partner. As this boss attack goes off, all players of the same role group will be targeted with massive damage that must be shared with one other person. This is where the partner pairs determined at the beginning come into play. If the boss is casting his beak attack, each partner pair will run to their assigned corner and stand with their partner in the available safe spot, as you can see here. If the boss is casting the room-wide donut attack, each partner pair will need to stand together within the safe area inside the center, as shown here. If the boss is casting the massive point-blank circle attack, the partner pairs can line up against the back edge of the platform far enough away from one another to avoid overlapping. Again, there is no cast bar for these attacks, and players will need to look at the boss's movement to determine which attack is incoming. Immediately after, the first set of Tri-Scourge debuff timers will begin to run out. The 4 players with the shorter ice timers will have the ice markers appear over their head and begin to count down. Once their debuff expires, these players will be afflicted with the freezing up debuff for 2 seconds, and they'll need to continuously move around during this time to avoid getting frozen. If they do get frozen, make sure to break them out of their ice block as quickly as possible. Next up, the boss will cast Mountain Fire. A tank buster tower will appear in front of the boss that must be soaked by a tank with cooldowns. This attack will deal high damage and apply a debuff on the affected tank, forcing the tanks to alternate tower soaks. There are 6 tower soaks in total, so be sure to plan those cooldowns appropriately. The tower soak attack also blasts out a room-wide attack with a very small safe zone directly behind the attack. For each tank buster, the boss will reposition to either the left, right, or middle, and the rest of the group will need to adjust to remain in line with the boss to stay inside the safe zone. Getting hit by this attack will probably kill you, so keep your eyes on the boss and adjust as necessary for each attack. Immediately after, the next Tri-Scourge debuff timer begins to run out on both healers. As soon as their timer runs out, they'll be hit by a massive attack that must be shared with their assigned light party. This attack will also leave behind a fire puddle that will persist for some time, and the light party will need to move out of it together to take the next hit of the attack. This will occur 3 times in a row and deals a massive amount of damage, so healers be ready with cooldowns and heals. After the 3rd stack and puddle, the last set of ice Tri-Scourge timers will go off. The 4 players with remaining ice timers will need to make sure they keep moving through their debuff at this time to avoid getting frozen. Another volcanic eruption will begin at this time from either the left or the right side. Move to the opposite side and dodge the ground circles in the same manner as before. The boss will again cast one of his 3 telegraphed attacks, and players will need to pair up in their assigned safe spots to share the incoming damage while also dodging the boss's attack. Immediately after, the final Tri-Scourge timers will start to go off. All players will need to spread to avoid overlapping overlapping the incoming lightning attacks. This deals a fair amount of damage, so healers be ready to top everyone off. The boss will then cast Disaster Zone, marking the end of the mini phase, dealing even more raid-wide damage and returning the platform to normal. Next up, Ruin Foretold will deal raid-wide damage and spawn 3 beacons on the platform. 2 players will be targeted with lineup markers, and the raid will need to split into their light parties to share the incoming damage. This attack also deals proximity-based damage, so the 2 tanks will need to stand first in line of their party to minimize damage. The boss is also throwing out multiple conal attacks during this time, so each party lineup will need to adjust into the available safe areas with every hit. Players will need to destroy the beacons as quickly as possible here, as the boss is charging up his gauge through the beacons and gaining a stacking damage up buff over time. Once all the beacons are destroyed, the boss will cast Thule Disaster. This will deal 3 raid-wide hits of damage, with the last one also adding the Perpetual Conflagration debuff on all players. This debuff will deal damage over time and persist until the boss is destroyed, so healers be ready. Next, the boss will cast Sky Ruin again, dealing high raid-wide damage and beginning the next mini phase. Players will have to look at the indicator that appears to identify which of the 2 possible mini phases to expect: Thunder or Ice. In the Thunder mini phase, the platform will change to form tiles that will levitate any players on them, similar to normal mode. The boss will again cast Tri-Scourge, and players will be afflicted by another round of Fire, Frost, and Lightning debuffs with specific timers. The Fire debuffs will begin to go off on the healers almost immediately here, and the raid will split into assigned light parties to share the incoming damage. Heal through the damage and get ready for the next mechanic. Hail of Feathers will bring down 6 feathers around the platform that will deal high proximity-based damage as they land. The pattern of feathers will always begin either on the left or right side of the platform and will only land on the non-levitating tiles. Once identified, the group can move to the opposite edge of the platform and then run around the outer edge in the direction opposite each feather drop, staying at the max distance from the dropping feathers to minimize damage. The boss will soon target these feathers and anyone caught levitating with lightning strikes, dealing lethal damage and causing the feathers to explode in wide circles. To handle this, players will need to destroy the first feather that dropped to form a safe zone inside a non-levitating tile, while they wait for the final feathers to drop. Once that feather is destroyed and the safe zone is opened, players should move on to that tile to wait out the lightning strikes. Next up, the timers of 4 players with lightning debuffs and 4 players with ice debuffs will begin to run out. The players with expiring ice timers will need to stand on a levitating tile. This will cause their ice block to form and drop down underneath them. The players with expiring lightning timers will need to spread apart on the non-levitating tiles. This attack will deal high damage, so healers will need to be ready to top them off after. Next up, the boss will cast one of his 3 possible telegraphed attacks, and players will need to dodge appropriately. A moment after this attack goes off, lightning attacks will occur in the areas players were standing in during the attack. To avoid death, as soon as the boss attack goes off, all players should move far away from where they were just standing to avoid getting hit. When the boss casts Thunderous Breath, the boss will dip down, casting a room-wide cleave and spawning a number of arcane spheres on the edge of the platform. To avoid both parts of this attack, players will need to find a levitating tile inside the safe lane between the arcane spheres. Next up, the remaining Tri-Scourge timers will begin to go off. Again, ice timers will need to stand on levitating tiles, while the lightning timers spread apart on the regular tiles. The boss will then start another telegraphed attack, and players will need to dodge appropriately before running away from where they were standing to dodge the extra lightning attack. The boss will then cast Disaster Zone, the mini phase will end, and the platform will return to normal. Next up, Ruin Fall will form a double-stacked tank buster tower in the center of the room. 3 tornado circles will appear on the back edge of the platform, and the boss will begin casting a knockback from the north edge of the platform. To handle all this, the 2 tanks will soak the tower together with cooldowns, while everyone uses their knockback immunity to avoid the knockback and tornadoes entirely. If you don't have a knockback immunity at this time, you'll need to pre-position yourself to avoid getting knocked into a tornado or off the platform. The boss will then cast Sky Ruin again, and the next mini phase begins. In the ice mini phase, the platform will change to have the extra mountainous areas that form the avalanches on 2 sides. The boss will again begin with a Tri-Scourge cast. The first set of timers will begin to expire immediately. The 2 tanks will have their ice timers going off, and they'll both need to move into their assigned corners to take a heavy-hitting, very wide circle attack. This attack will also apply a damage over time debuff on each tank. At the exact same time, the 2 healers will have their fire timers going off, and the remainder of each light party will need to stack with them to share the damage. Cool down and heal through this combo of damage as necessary. Next up, players will have to be on the lookout for the first avalanche. The boss will also cast one of his telegraphed attacks here, and players will have to move out of the way of the avalanche and dodge the boss attacks as necessary. Immediately after, 5 arcane spheres will appear in one of 2 possible patterns. An easy safe spot will always occur near the Alpha or Charlie markers if you have your waymarkers arranged like this, depending on the pattern of spheres. Basically, you're looking for the open gap between the spheres and moving in front of the waymarker in that area. This will be easier to recognize with practice, so don't worry if you struggle at first. Next up, the first round of lightning debuff timers will start to go off. These affected players will need to spread away from each other to avoid overlapping damage. Shield and heal as necessary. The boss will then cast Spikesicle, and this is handled in the same manner as in the beginning of the fight. Identify which side the blue line first appears on and move to the opposite end. The raid can begin to move back towards the center as the spike attacks begin, but as they do so, they'll need to pay attention to the incoming avalanche as well. The same safe zone on the very tip of the boss's hitbox arrow marker will be safe from all attacks, regardless of which side the avalanche is coming from, after the first 2 ice boulders explode. The positioning is very tight, so watch your feet. Alternatively, you can also dodge into the ice boulder explosions as they go off away from the avalanche side, if you feel more comfortable doing that. The boss will telegraph another one of his attacks, and players will need to dodge accordingly. Another round of arcane spheres will appear, and players need to quickly move into the safe spot as the next avalanche forms. As soon as the arcane spheres resolve, players must immediately move to dodge the avalanche as necessary. The boss will then cast Freezing Dust and attempt to freeze any players not moving. Keep moving through the debuff to avoid getting turned into an ice block. If someone does get frozen here, make sure to break them out ASAP. The final set of Tri-Scourge debuff timers will begin to go off here as well. Affected players will need to spread their lightning attacks apart to avoid overlap. The boss will then cast Disaster Zone, dealing more raid-wide damage and returning the platform back to normal. Ice Talon will target the top 2 enmity targets with these wide Tankbuster circle attacks. Move away from others, cool down, and heal as necessary. At this point, the boss will cast Wrath Unfurled, gaining a buff and essentially beginning the Enrage sequence. He'll cast another Mountain Fire, and the tanks will need to again alternate soaking 6 Tankbuster towers, while the rest of the raid adjusts with the boss's position to remain in the safe spot formed behind the attack. The boss will cast one more Thule Disaster, and you'll have a few seconds to destroy him before he destroys you with that third blast. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll look at Everkeep Extreme. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.